Robert Mitchell's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the emergency room wheelchair, 40 years of silent agony finally breaking through his marine-tough facade. The sterile fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as his son David knelt beside him, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since Vietnam. It wasn't just another flare-up of his old war wound. The dark, foul-smelling stains spreading through the bandage told a different story entirely. The attending nurse dropped her clipboard with a sharp clatter, her face draining of color as the antiseptic smell failed to mask something far more sinister. A young resident stumbled backward, pressing his hand against the wall for support. David's medical training kicked in as he noticed his father's lips had turned an alarming shade of blue, the same color as the winter sky the day his mother Sarah had collapsed in their kitchen 3 years ago. "Get Dr. Harrison down here now!" The head nurse barked into her radio, her voice cracking with urgency she couldn't hide. What had been growing inside Bobby Mitchell's leg for 4 decades? And why were the doctors looking at him like they'd never seen anything like it before? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Bobby Mitchell had been Boston's most stubborn man for as long as anyone could remember, and that was saying something in a neighborhood full of Irish longshoremen and Italian bricklayers. At 65, he still insisted on opening Mitchell's Auto Repair at dawn every morning, his pronounced limp from Vietnam barely slowing him down as he shuffled between the hydraulic lifts and tool benches that had been his second home for 3 decades. The brick colonial on Maple Street, where Bobby lived alone, told the story of a man who'd built everything twice, once with his beloved wife Sarah, and again after losing her to cancer 3 years ago. Her vegetable garden had grown wild without her careful tending, but Bobby couldn't bring himself to clear it. Some mornings, neighbors would catch him standing among the overgrown tomato vines with his coffee mug, talking to memories only he could see. "Can't complain," became Bobby's standard response to anyone who asked how he was doing, though Mrs. Henderson next door noticed he'd started saying it through gritted teeth. She'd watched him for 40 years, ever since he came home from Southeast Asia with a Purple Heart and a limp that never quite healed right. Back then, Sarah would fuss over him, changing his bandages and making sure he took his medication. These days, Bobby managed alone, and it showed in the way he favored his left leg more heavily each winter. David Mitchell inherited his father's stubborn streak but channeled it differently. At 38, the paramedic had seen enough trauma to recognize when someone was hiding pain, especially when that someone was his own father. Every Sunday dinner became a gentle interrogation disguised as family time, with David's wife Jennifer mediating between 2 men who loved each other but spoke different languages when it came to admitting weakness. "Dad's been taking more aspirin lately," Jennifer would whisper to David after Bobby left their kitchen table. "I counted the bottles when I was helping him with groceries." Their children, 12-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Jake, had grown up thinking it was normal for Grandpa to wince when he stood up, to grip the stair railing just a little too tightly, to sometimes pause mid-sentence when a wave of pain caught him off guard. The auto shop served as Bobby's sanctuary and torture chamber both. Regular customers like Frank Kowalski and Maria Santos had learned to read the signs. On bad days, Bobby would lean heavily against the workbench while explaining their car troubles, his knuckles white from gripping the edge. On really bad days, he'd send them to Tommy's garage down the street rather than admit he couldn't crawl under their vehicles. But Bobby Mitchell was a Marine, and Marines didn't quit. He'd survived the Mekong Delta, buried his wife, and raised a son who turned out better than he'd dared hope. A little leg pain wasn't going to break him now, even if some nights he bit down on Sarah's old dish towel to keep from screaming loud enough to wake Mrs. Henderson. The morning that changed everything started like any other Monday in Bobby Mitchell's carefully ordered world. His alarm clock buzzed at 5:30, just as it had for 40 years, but when he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, something was different. The familiar ache in his left calf had transformed overnight into something that made him gasp and grab the nightstand for support. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, a prayer more than a curse, as he looked down at his leg. The old wound site, usually just a puckered scar surrounded by slightly discolored skin, had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Worse still, the bandage he'd applied the night before was soaked through with something dark and foul-smelling that made his stomach turn. Bobby had endured 4 decades of pain, but this was different. This was his body finally surrendering after a lifetime of silent warfare. He tried to stand, to follow his morning routine of coffee and crossword puzzles, but his leg buckled beneath him. For the first time since Vietnam, Robert Mitchell found himself on his bedroom floor, defeated by his own body. 3 miles away, David Mitchell was starting his shift at the firehouse when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Dad never called this early, never called for help at all. Something cold settled in David's chest as he heard his father's voice, smaller and more fragile than he'd ever heard it. "Son, I think I might need that ride to the doctor you're always talking about." David broke every speed limit between the firehouse and Maple Street. What he found when he used his spare key made his EMT training kick into overdrive. Bobby sat on the edge of his bed, fully dressed but pale as winter snow, holding a blood-soaked towel against his leg. The smell hit David immediately. Infection, but worse than anything he'd encountered in 10 years of emergency medicine. "Dad, how long has it been like this?" "Just today," Bobby lied, though David could see in his father's eyes that this had been building for weeks, maybe months. "Probably just needs some cleaning, maybe stronger antibiotics." But when David gently moved the towel aside, he saw something that made his professional composure crack. The wound wasn't just infected, it was actively deteriorating, edges black and weeping, surrounding tissue angry and swollen. This wasn't something that happened overnight. "We're going to the hospital, Dad, right now. I've survived worse than this, son. Remember when I had that bout of pneumonia? Your mother made me soup, and Mom's not here anymore, Dad." The words came out harsher than David intended, but they needed to be said. "And this isn't pneumonia. This is serious." The ride to Boston General took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Bobby sat rigid in the passenger seat, one hand gripping the door handle, the other pressed against his leg. He stared out the window at the familiar streets of his neighborhood, suddenly afraid this might be the last time he'd see Mrs. Henderson's rose garden or the corner market where he'd bought cigarettes for Sarah during her chemo treatments. "Maybe I should have listened to you boys sooner," Bobby admitted as they pulled into the emergency entrance. It was the closest thing to an apology David had ever heard from his father. The emergency room at 9 on a Monday morning was controlled chaos. Nurses moving with practiced efficiency, residents gulping coffee between patients, the steady beep and hum of medical equipment providing a technological soundtrack to human suffering. Bobby had been here before, during Sarah's illness, but never as the patient requiring urgent attention. Doctor. Patricia Williams, a second-year resident with kind eyes and steady hands, took one look at Bobby's leg and called for the attending physician. Her examination was gentle but thorough, and David watched her expression change from professional concern to something closer to puzzlement. "Mr. Mitchell, can you tell me about the original injury? When did this wound first occur?" "Vietnam, 1983. Shrapnel from a mortar round. They cleaned it out best they could in the field hospital, sewed me up, sent me home." "And it's never fully healed in 40 years? "Nah, Doc. Always been a troublemaker. Some days better, some days worse. My wife used to say it had a mind of its own." Dr. Williams exchanged glances with the attending, Dr. Robert Chen, who had appeared during the examination. Both physicians had seen their share of chronic wounds, but something about Bobby's case didn't fit the usual patterns. "We're going to start you on broad-spectrum antibiotics, Doctor," Williams explained, her voice carrying the confidence of medical training. "This looks like a fairly straightforward infection that's gotten out of hand. 3 days of IV antibiotics should clear this right up and you'll be back to your normal routine. Bobby felt the first real relief he'd experienced in weeks. Just an infection. Nothing modern medicine couldn't handle. He squeezed David's hand and managed his first genuine smile since the pain had become unbearable. Neither of them noticed the slight frown that crossed Dr. Chen's face as he made notes in Bobby's chart. Thursday night arrived with the kind of bone-deep cold that made Boston winters legendary, and Bobby Mitchell was losing his battle against something far more relentless than New England weather. The antibiotics that had promised salvation 3 days earlier had proven as useless as wishful thinking. Instead of improvement, Bobby's condition had spiraled into something that defied Dr. Williams's confident predictions and shattered his family's cautious optimism. David's emergency medical training had taught him to recognize the signs of systemic infection, but nothing had prepared him for watching his father's steady decline from the helpless position of son rather than first responder. The phone call came at 11:15 p.m. Bobby's voice, barely a whisper. "I think you better come get me, son. Something's not right." When David arrived at the Maple Street house, he found his father sitting in Sarah's old rocking chair, the one she'd used during her final months. Bobby was shivering despite the heavy wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and the smell that had first appeared 3 days ago had intensified into something that made David's trained nose recoil. This wasn't just infection anymore. This was his father's body losing a war it had fought courageously for 4 decades. "Dad, we need to go back to the hospital. Now." "They already tried their magic pills," Bobby replied, his voice carrying a defeat that cut through David's heart like shrapnel. "Maybe it's just my time, son. Maybe I've been living on borrowed time since Vietnam, and the bills finally come due." But David Mitchell had inherited his father's Marine stubbornness, and he wasn't ready to surrender. "Sarah didn't raise a quitter, and neither did you. We're going to fight this." The emergency room at Boston General looked different at midnight. Quieter, more intense, staffed by the night shift warriors who handled the city's darkest hours. But when the triage nurse saw Bobby's condition, the controlled calm shattered. Within minutes, they were surrounded by medical professionals moving with the urgent precision reserved for life-threatening emergencies. Dr. James Harrison arrived 20 minutes later, summoned from his home by a call that described symptoms no resident wanted to handle alone. At 58, Harrison had spent 30 years in surgery, treating everything from routine appendectomies to complex trauma cases that would challenge textbook knowledge. His reputation for taking impossible cases had made him a legend at Boston General, the surgeon other doctors called when conventional medicine failed. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Harrison. I understand you're having some complications with an old wound." Bobby nodded weakly, too exhausted for his usual stoic responses. Harrison's examination was different from Dr. Williams's assessment. More thorough, more concerned, accompanied by the kind of focused attention that comes from decades of reading the subtle signs that separate manageable problems from medical emergencies. "How long did you say you've been dealing with this wound?" 40 years, Doc. Since Vietnam. Always been a pain, but never like this." Harrison's hands moved carefully around the infected area, his expression growing more serious with each observation. The swelling had increased dramatically since Monday, the discoloration spreading beyond the original wound site, and the discharge had taken on characteristics that didn't match any standard infection pattern he'd encountered. "David, isn't it? You're his son?" "Yes, sir. I'm an EMT with Boston Fire." "Good. Then you'll understand when I tell you that your father needs immediate surgical intervention. This infection has progressed beyond what antibiotics can handle. We need to open the wound, clean out all the infected tissue, and see exactly what we're dealing with." The words hit the family like physical blows. Jennifer, who had arrived with their children after David's panicked phone call, felt her knees weaken. Emma and Jake, still in their pajamas, pressed closer to their mother, sensing the gravity without understanding the details. "Surgery?" Bobby's voice cracked slightly. "Doc, I'm 65 years old. How much more can this old body take? Mr. Mitchell, I've been doing this for 3 decades. I've seen Marines who survived worse than Vietnam, and I've seen 20-year-olds who couldn't handle a paper cut. Age is just a number. What matters is whether you're ready to fight." The family conference that followed in the small consultation room felt like a military briefing, complete with tactical assessments and strategic decisions that would determine whether Bobby lived or died. Dr. Harrison explained the risks with the clinical precision that comes from delivering similar news countless times. But David could see something in the surgeon's eyes that suggested this case was different somehow. The surgery itself is straightforward: debridement and cleaning of infected tissue. What concerns me is how extensive the infection appears to be. We won't know the full scope until we open the wound site. "What if—" Jennifer's voice trailed off, unable to finish the question that terrified them all. "If the infection has spread too far, if there's more damage than we can repair, then we'll deal with that when we see it. But right now, surgery is his best chance." Bobby listened to the medical discussions swirling around him, feeling oddly detached from decisions about his own body. 40 years ago, in a jungle halfway around the world, he'd faced death with the simple acceptance that comes from being 19 and invincible. Now at 65, with Sarah gone and his body finally admitting defeat, he felt something different. Not fear of dying, but fear of leaving his family unprepared for a world without him. "Doc, if something goes wrong in there, I need to know my family will be taken care of." "Dad, don't talk like that," David interrupted. But Bobby raised a trembling hand. "I need to say this, son. Your mother made me promise to take care of this leg, to not let it become a burden on you kids. I failed her on that promise. Don't let me fail on this one too." Dr. Harrison had delivered enough pre-surgical consultations to recognize the moment when a patient crosses from hope to acceptance. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been doing this long enough to know that the fighters are the ones who surprise me." "Are you ready to fight?" Bobby looked around the room at his family. His son, who'd inherited Sarah's compassionate heart, his daughter-in-law, who'd embraced him as her own father, his grandchildren, who still believed Grandpa could fix anything. For them, he could find the strength for one more battle. "Let's do this thing, Doc." Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Boston winter day that made even the most optimistic souls question their life choices. Inside Operating Room 7 at Boston General, Dr. James Harrison prepared for what he assumed would be a routine debridement procedure on a stubborn chronic wound. The surgical team assembled with practiced efficiency. Anesthesiologist Dr. Maria Santos, surgical nurse Patricia Kim, and resident Dr. Williams, who had requested to observe after her initial treatment had failed. Bobby Mitchell lay unconscious on the operating table, his weathered face peaceful for the first time in months. The anesthesia had finally granted him the rest that had eluded him through countless sleepless nights, though David worried that his father looked smaller somehow, as if the fight had already begun to leave his body. In the surgical waiting room 3 floors below, the Mitchell family had settled into the uncomfortable vigil that defines hospital time. David paced between the coffee machine and the windows overlooking the parking garage, his EMT training making him hyper-aware of every announcement over the hospital's PA system. Jennifer had claimed a corner spot near the children's play area, keeping Emma and Jake occupied with coloring books and whispered stories, though her eyes never strayed far from the clock above the reception desk. Mrs. Henderson had arrived before dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and a lifetime's worth of maternal instinct. At 72, she'd buried 2 husbands and raised 3 children, giving her the kind of perspective that comes only from surviving life's hardest lessons. She took one look at Jennifer's barely controlled panic and positioned herself as the family's unofficial commander, delegating tasks and managing the steady stream of visitors who began arriving as word spread through the neighborhood. "Surgery scheduled for 2 hours," she announced to the growing crowd. "Frank Kowalski's bringing sandwiches at noon. Maria Santos, that's the one from the grocery store, not the doctor, she's handling dinner. And Tommy from the other garage, he's making sure Bobby's shop stays locked up tight." The first hour passed with agonizing normalcy. Dr. Harrison had warned them that the procedure would take time, that thorough cleaning of a chronic wound required patience and precision. David found himself studying the other families in the waiting room, wondering if their vigils would end in celebration or devastation, trying to read hope or despair in their expressions. It was during the second hour that the first sign of trouble appeared. Dr. Williams emerged from the surgical suite, her scrub still clean, but her expression carrying something that made David's stomach clench. She spoke quietly with the charge nurse, glancing toward the Mitchell family before disappearing back through the double doors. "That can't be good," Jennifer whispered, unconsciously pulling Jake closer. "Could be anything," David replied, though his own medical training suggested otherwise. Residents didn't leave surgery to make casual consultations unless something unexpected was happening. The third hour brought Dr. Santos, the anesthesiologist, into the waiting room. Her brief conversation with the family liaison nurse included words like stable and proceeding, but also complications and additional time required. David felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency calls, except this time he was helpless to respond. Mrs. Henderson moved into action with the efficiency of someone who'd managed crisis before. "Emma, honey, why don't you and Jake come help me get more coffee? Your daddy and mommy need to talk to the grown-ups for a minute." As the children were gently shepherded away, Dr. Santos approached the family with the careful expression of someone delivering news that wasn't quite bad, but certainly wasn't good. "Mr. Mitchell's vital signs are stable, and Dr. Harrison wants you to know that your father is doing well under anesthesia. However, the surgical site is more complex than we initially anticipated. Dr. Harrison has called in Dr. Rebecca Foster from Infectious Diseases to consult." Jennifer's nursing background kicked in. What kind of complexity? "The infection appears to have created some unusual tissue formations. Nothing immediately dangerous, but Dr. Harrison wants additional expertise before proceeding. It's actually quite fascinating from a medical perspective." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with Boston's winter weather. In his experience, when doctors started using words like fascinating and unusual, it usually meant they were encountering something beyond their normal experience. The fourth hour brought a steady stream of neighborhood visitors that transformed the waiting room into an impromptu community gathering. Frank Kowalski arrived with enough deli sandwiches to feed half the hospital, explaining gruffly that Bobby fixed my transmission for free when I was out of work, so this is the least I can do. Maria Santos from the grocery store brought homemade soup that filled the waiting area with the comforting smell of garlic and herbs. Even Tommy Russo from the competing auto shop appeared, carrying coffee and the grudging admission that Bobby Mitchell might be stubborn as hell, but he's the most honest mechanic in Boston. Dr. Foster's consultation lasted 45 minutes, during which David counted every tick of the waiting room clock. When she emerged, her conversation with the surgical team coordinator involved animated gestures and what appeared to be requests for additional equipment. The words "unprecedented" and "documentation" drifted across the waiting room, causing Jennifer to grip David's hand with enough force to cut off circulation. 5 hours, David muttered, checking his watch for the 100th time. 2-hour surgery is now 5 hours. Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly observing the medical team's increased activity, settled beside Jennifer with the weight of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize when ordinary situations became extraordinary. Honey, I've been watching doctors for 7 decades. When they start getting excited instead of worried, that usually means they've found something interesting, rather than something terrible. The arrival of Dr. Chen, the attending physician from Monday's emergency room visit, confirmed Mrs. Henderson's observation. His consultation with the surgical team was animated but not urgent, suggesting professional curiosity rather than medical crisis. When he emerged from the surgical area, he made a point of approaching the Mitchell family directly. "I wanted to update you personally. Your father is doing very well. Dr. Harrison has encountered something quite remarkable in the surgical site, and he's asked me to help document the findings. Bobby's vital signs are excellent and there's no immediate danger, but this case is turning out to be medically significant." Significant how? David's EMT training demanded specifics. The infection appears to have created a very unusual bacterial environment. It's actually quite stable, almost like the bacteria have reached some kind of equilibrium with the surrounding tissue. Dr. Harrison has never seen anything quite like it in 30 years of surgery. Jennifer felt her nursing instincts engage. Is that good or bad? Honestly, we're not entirely sure yet. That's why we're being so thorough. This could provide valuable insights into how chronic infections develop and adapt over time. As the 6th hour approached, the waiting room had transformed into a neighborhood command center. Mrs. Henderson had organized meal schedules. Maria Santos was coordinating childcare for families with small children, and Frank Kowalski was holding court near the coffee machine, sharing stories about Bobby's mechanical genius that had saved countless family budgets over the years. Emma and Jake had adapted to their extended hospital stay with the resilience that children somehow manage, turning the waiting room chairs into a fort and recruiting other young visitors into elaborate games of hospital adventure. Their laughter provided a counterpoint to the underlying tension that gripped every adult in the room. Dr. Harrison finally emerged just after 3 o'clock, his surgical scrubs replaced by clean clothes, and his expression carrying something David couldn't quite read. It wasn't relief exactly, but it wasn't concern either. If anything, the veteran surgeon looked amazed. "The surgery was successful," he announced, and the collective exhale from 30-plus people created a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Bobby's in recovery, and his vital signs are strong. However, I need to prepare you for some unusual findings." The family gathered in the small consultation room while Mrs. Henderson managed the crowd outside. Dr. Harrison's explanation began with medical terminology that gradually simplified as he recognized the family's growing confusion. "In 40 years of surgery, I have never encountered anything like what we found in your father's leg. The infection has created what can only be described as a complex bacterial ecosystem. Instead of simply destroying tissue, these organisms appear to have developed a symbiotic relationship with Bobby's body." David's medical training struggled to process the information. Symbiotic. "You mean they're helping him somehow?" That's what's so remarkable. The bacteria seem to have evolved to coexist with the surrounding tissue. They're actually producing compounds that appear to fight off more dangerous infections. It's as if Bobby's body has been conducting a 40-year medical experiment. Jennifer felt the world shift slightly. "Are you saying the infection has been protecting him?" "I'm saying we've discovered something that challenges everything we thought we knew about chronic infections. This could revolutionize how we treat similar cases." The implications hung in the air like incense, transforming Bobby's decades of suffering into something approaching medical miracle. 40 years of pain had created something unprecedented, something that could help countless other patients. "Is he going to be okay?" Emma's small voice cut through the adult conversation, reminding everyone what really mattered. "Doctor." Harrison smiled, the first genuine expression of joy any of them had seen from him. "Your grandfather is going to be more than okay. He's going to be famous." The recovery room at Boston General buzzed with an energy that veteran nurses recognized as the quiet excitement that preceded medical breakthroughs. Bobby Mitchell lay connected to monitors that painted reassuring patterns across their screens, his color better than it had been in weeks, despite the surgical ordeal. Dr. Harrison had rarely seen a 65-year-old patient respond so well to such extensive tissue exploration. But then again, Bobby Mitchell was proving to be extraordinary in ways no one had anticipated. Word of the unusual surgical findings spread through the hospital's corridors with the speed that only truly remarkable cases could generate. Dr. Rebecca Foster from Infectious Diseases had already placed calls to colleagues at Harvard Medical School and Johns Hopkins, her voice carrying the barely contained excitement of someone who'd stumbled upon something that might rewrite medical textbooks. The bacterial cultures taken during surgery were growing in the lab under conditions that mimicked the 40-year environment of Bobby's leg, and early observations suggested formations unlike anything in current medical literature. David spent the first hour after surgery alternating between relief and bewilderment, watching his father's peaceful breathing while trying to process Dr. Harrison's explanation. The man he'd grown up watching suffer in stoic silence had apparently been hosting a medical marvel that could change how doctors understood chronic infections. It felt surreal, like discovering that the family's old house had been built over buried treasure. "Daddy, when can we see Grandpa?" Emma asked, tugging on David's sleeve with the impatience of a 12-year-old who'd spent 6 hours in a waiting room. Her drawings from earlier had evolved throughout the day, starting with flowers and rainbows and gradually incorporating medical equipment and hospital scenes, her young mind processing the day's drama through art. "Soon, sweetheart. The doctors want to make sure he's completely awake first." David stroked his daughter's hair, marveling at how children could adapt to extraordinary circumstances with such grace. Jake had fallen asleep against Jennifer's shoulder, exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of the day. Mrs. Henderson had appointed herself the family's unofficial media coordinator, fielding phone calls from neighbors and managing the steady stream of visitors who'd heard about Bobby's surgery through Boston's efficient neighborhood network. "Channel 5 wants an interview," she announced, waving her cell phone like a battle flag. "Told them Bobby's not talking to nobody until he's had his first cup of real coffee and decides for himself." The first hint of the story's larger implications came when Dr. Chen approached the family with a tablet displaying news headlines. "Bobby's case has caught the attention of the medical community faster than we anticipated," he explained, scrolling through articles from medical journals and research institutions. "Harvard wants to include his case in their chronic infection studies. The CDC has requested copies of our findings, and somehow the Boston Globe got wind of the story." Jennifer felt a familiar maternal instinct to protect her family's privacy, even as she recognized the potential importance of Bobby's condition. "What does this mean for him, for us?" "It means your father-in-law has become medically famous, whether he wants to be or not. The bacterial formations we found are unprecedented. Other hospitals are already asking if they can send similar cases here for evaluation." Frank Kowalski, who'd been listening from his post near the coffee machine, approached with the directness that characterized most of Bobby's customers. "Doc, I've known Bobby Mitchell for 20 years. He never wanted fame, never wanted attention. What he wanted was to fix cars and take care of his family. You sure this medical circus is good for him?" Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That's ultimately Bobby's decision. But what we've learned from his case could help thousands of patients with similar chronic conditions. Sometimes individual suffering serves a larger purpose." The philosophical implications of Frank's observations settled over the waiting room like a comfortable blanket. Bobby had indeed spent 40 years simply trying to live his life despite constant pain, never seeking sympathy or special treatment. The idea that his private struggle might become a public contribution to medical knowledge felt both appropriate and overwhelming. Dr. Harrison returned as evening shadows began stretching across the waiting room windows, his expression carrying the satisfied exhaustion of a surgeon who'd completed something significant. "Bobby's awake and asking for coffee," he announced, triggering the first genuine laughter the family had shared all day. "He's also asking why so many people are making a fuss over a little cleaning job." The reunion in Bobby's hospital room was carefully orchestrated chaos. Emma and Jake approached their grandfather's bed with the cautious reverence children reserve for beloved adults who've been revealed as mortal, while David and Jennifer flanked the bed like protective sentries. Mrs. Henderson positioned herself near the door, ready to manage any unwanted intrusions. "Well, this is a hell of a thing," Bobby said, his voice hoarse but distinctly his own. "Doc tells me I've been carrying around some kind of medical curiosity for 40 years. Sarah always said I was special, but I don't think this is what she had in mind." The mention of Sarah brought the familiar catch to Bobby's voice that appeared whenever he spoke of his late wife, but today it was softened by something approaching wonder. For the first time since her death, Bobby seemed to find meaning in his suffering that extended beyond simple endurance. "Grandpa, are you really going to be in medical books?" Emma asked, her 12-year-old fascination with the dramatic overriding any worry about propriety. "Seems that way, sweetheart, though I suspect they'll use prettier pictures than this old Marine provides." Bobby's attempt at humor couldn't quite mask the bewilderment in his eyes. 40 years of private pain had suddenly become public fascination, and he wasn't sure how to process the transformation. "Doctor." Foster arrived with a small army of residents and medical students, their excitement barely contained by professional decorum. "Mr. Mitchell, your case has generated enormous interest in the medical community. The bacterial cultures we took during surgery are showing formations that challenge our understanding of how chronic infections develop. Doc, I appreciate all the attention, but I'm just a guy who got hurt in Vietnam and never healed right. I'm not sure what all the excitement is about." "What's exciting is that your body appears to have developed a unique response to chronic infection. Instead of simply fighting the bacteria, your immune system learned to coexist with them. The bacteria, in turn, seem to have evolved to protect the surrounding tissue from more dangerous infections." Jennifer felt her nursing training engage as she processed the implications. "You're saying Bobby's infection has been protecting him from worse infections?" "That's exactly what we're saying. It's as if his body conducted a 40-year medical experiment that we're only now beginning to understand." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like snow, transforming Bobby's decades of suffering into something approaching medical miracle. Every sleepless night, every hidden wince of pain, every moment of silent endurance had contributed to a discovery that might help countless other patients. Bobby stared at the ceiling tiles, processing information that challenged his understanding of his own life. "So you're telling me that all those years of Sarah changing bandages, all those nights I bit down on towels to keep from screaming, all of that was actually accomplishing something?" "More than something, Dad," David said, taking his father's hand. "It was creating something that could help millions of people." Mrs. Henderson, who'd remained uncharacteristically quiet during the medical explanation, finally spoke with the authority that comes from 7 decades of witnessing life's strange twists. "Bobby Mitchell, I've watched you suffer in silence for 40 years, never complaining, never asking for help. If anyone deserves to have their pain mean something, it's you." The evening news played on the television mounted in the corner of Bobby's room, and the family watched in amazement as their private medical crisis became part of the day's headlines. "Boston veteran's chronic wound yields medical breakthrough," the anchor announced, accompanied by file footage of Boston General and interviews with medical experts discussing the implications of symbiotic bacterial relationships. Famous, Bobby muttered, shaking his head. Sarah's going to get such a kick out of this when I see her again. She always said I'd make my mark on the world somehow. As visiting hours ended and the family prepared to leave Bobby for his first night in the hospital, the magnitude of the day's events began to settle into perspective. What had started as a medical emergency had evolved into something that might change how doctors approached chronic infections worldwide. "Dad," David said, leaning over the hospital bed, "I'm proud of you. Not just for surviving today, but for surviving 40 years of this." Bobby squeezed his son's hand with strength that surprised them both. "I didn't survive it, son. We all did. Every bandage Sarah changed, every worry you carried, every time you kids just loved an old Marine who couldn't fix himself. This isn't just my story." The call came at 4:30 in the morning, dragging David from the first deep sleep he'd managed since his father's surgery 3 days earlier. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Harrison, but the calm confidence that had characterized all their previous conversations was gone, replaced by something that made David's blood run cold. "David, you need to get to the hospital immediately. Your father's condition has taken a serious turn." The drive through Boston's empty pre-dawn streets felt like navigating a nightmare. Jennifer sat beside him, clutching her phone and trying to reach Mrs. Henderson to arrange emergency childcare for Emma and Jake. Neither of them spoke about what they feared most, that Bobby's miraculous medical discovery had come at the cost of his life. Boston General's intensive care unit operated under different rules than the regular hospital floors. Visiting hours became meaningless when patients teetered on the edge between life and death. David and Jennifer found themselves in a sterile waiting area reserved for families whose loved ones required the most intensive medical intervention available. Dr. Harrison met them with the haggard expression of a surgeon who'd spent the night fighting a battle he wasn't sure he could win. Bobby developed complications around midnight. What appeared to be a successful surgery has triggered a massive inflammatory response. His body is essentially attacking itself. The medical explanation that followed felt like listening to someone describe a car accident in slow motion. Bobby's immune system, which had coexisted peacefully with the bacterial ecosystem for 40 years, had gone into overdrive following the surgical disruption. His white blood cell count had skyrocketed, his fever had spiked to dangerous levels, and multiple organ systems were showing signs of distress. "Is he going to die?" Jennifer asked with the directness that nursing training had taught her to appreciate in crisis situations. "I don't know," Dr. Harrison admitted, and his honesty was more terrifying than any euphemism could have been. "We're doing everything we can, but his body seems to be rejecting the very treatments that should be helping him." Through the ICU windows, David could see his father connected to more machines than seemed possible for one human being to require. Bobby lay unconscious, his face pale and drawn, looking smaller and more fragile than David had ever imagined possible. The man who had survived Vietnam, buried his wife, and endured 40 years of chronic pain was finally meeting an opponent he might not be able to defeat. Mrs. Henderson arrived at dawn, having somehow convinced the ICU staff that she was essential family despite no blood relation. She took one look at Bobby through the window and settled into the waiting area with the grim determination of someone preparing for a siege. "I sat with Sarah during her worst nights," she announced to no one in particular. "I'm not leaving Bobby to face this alone." The medical team's morning briefing included specialists from infectious diseases, immunology, and internal medicine, but their collective expertise seemed inadequate to address Bobby's condition. Dr. Foster explained that removing the bacterial ecosystem during surgery had apparently destabilized an immune balance that had taken decades to establish. "It's like we disrupted a peace treaty that his body had negotiated over 40 years, she said, her usual scientific enthusiasm replaced by professional frustration. "His immune system is treating the surgical site as if it's under attack by foreign invaders, but it's actually attacking healthy tissue. The irony was devastating. The same bacterial relationship that had made Bobby medically famous was now killing him because they'd tried to study it. His body had learned to coexist with chronic infection so completely that surgical intervention had triggered an autoimmune crisis. Frank Kowalski arrived during visiting hours, carrying coffee and the kind of stubborn loyalty that characterized Bobby's long-term customers. 40 years I've been bringing my cars to Bobby Mitchell, he told the ICU nurse who tried to limit visitors. That man has never let me down, and I'm not walking away from him now. By noon, the waiting area had filled with neighbors, customers, and fellow veterans who'd heard about Bobby's crisis through Boston's efficient community network. Tommy Russo from the competing auto shop sat beside Maria Santos from the grocery store, their usual business rivalry set aside in the face of larger concerns. The hospital staff, accustomed to managing family crises, found themselves dealing with an entire neighborhood's emotional investment in one patient's survival. Emma and Jake arrived after school with the confused sadness that children experience when adults they trust seem helpless. Emma's drawings from the previous week, which had celebrated Grandpa's medical fame, were replaced by pictures of angels and clouds that made Jennifer's heart break. "Is Grandpa going to die like Grandma did?" Jake asked, with the brutal honesty that 8-year-olds employ when they need answers. Adults don't want to give. David knelt beside his son, struggling to find words that balanced truth with hope. "We don't know, buddy. The doctors are doing everything they can, but sometimes bodies get too tired to keep fighting." The afternoon brought Dr. Chen with updates that carried no real news. Bobby's condition remained critical, his response to treatment minimal, his prognosis uncertain. The medical team was consulting with experts from around the country, but Bobby's case had moved beyond standard treatments into uncharted territory. "We're considering some experimental approaches," Dr. Chen explained to the family during their evening conference. "There are immune suppression protocols that might calm his body's response, but they carry significant risks for a man his age." Jennifer felt her nursing background engage. "What kind of risks?" "Suppressing his immune system could leave him vulnerable to infections he can't fight. We might save him from attacking himself only to lose him to something else." The choice felt impossible. Treat the crisis and risk creating new problems, or watch Bobby's body destroy itself in its misguided attempt at self-defense. David found himself wishing his father was conscious to make the decision himself, then immediately feeling guilty for wanting to burden a dying man with impossible choices. Dr. Harrison joined the family conference with the exhausted demeanor of someone who'd spent 48 hours fighting a medical puzzle that defied solution. "I need to be honest with you. In 30 years of surgery, I've never seen a case quite like this. We're essentially improvising treatments for a condition that doesn't exist in medical literature." The community vigil that had begun as celebration of Bobby's medical breakthrough had transformed into something approaching a neighborhood wake. Mrs. Henderson coordinated meal schedules and childcare arrangements with the efficiency of someone who'd managed family crises before, while Frank Kowalski appointed himself the unofficial spokesperson for Bobby's business concerns. "Shops closed until further notice," he announced to anyone who asked. "Bobby's customers understand. Some things are more important than car repairs." As evening approached, the ICU staff began limiting visitors to immediate family, but the waiting room remained full of people who refused to abandon their vigil. David realized that his father had spent 40 years quietly building a community that extended far beyond blood relations, and that community wasn't ready to let him go without a fight. Dr. Foster appeared just before visiting hours ended with lab results that added another layer of complexity to Bobby's condition. "The bacterial cultures we took during surgery are still thriving in laboratory conditions. They seem to be producing compounds that we don't fully understand. possibly anti-inflammatory agents that were helping regulate his immune response. "You're saying the bacteria were actually protecting him?" David asked. "We're beginning to think that's exactly what they were doing. Removing them may have eliminated his body's natural mechanism for controlling inflammation." The revelation hung in the air like incense, transforming Bobby's crisis from medical complication to tragic irony. 40 years of bacterial coexistence had created a biological balance so delicate that disrupting it had triggered the very crisis they'd hoped to prevent. Jennifer looked through the ICU window at her father-in-law, surrounded by machines that were keeping him alive while his own body tried to kill him. So the infection that caused him 40 years of pain was also keeping him alive? "That's what we're starting to suspect," Dr. Foster admitted. "And now we have to figure out how to save him from the cure." Sunday morning brought Dr. Elizabeth Chen to Boston General like an answered prayer, wrapped in a rumpled business suit and carrying a laptop bag that had seen better decades. The CDC researcher had caught a red-eye flight from Atlanta after receiving Dr. Foster's desperate consultation request, her 20 years of studying symbiotic bacterial relationships making her perhaps the only person in the country qualified to understand Bobby Mitchell's crisis. David first glimpsed her through the ICU waiting room windows, a compact woman in her 50s with graying hair and the intense focus of someone accustomed to solving medical puzzles that defeated other experts. She moved through the hospital corridors with purposeful efficiency, stopping briefly to examine Bobby's chart before requesting immediate access to the bacterial cultures that had been growing in the lab since his surgery. "What if we've been looking at this completely wrong, Doctor?" Chen asked during the emergency medical conference that assembled Bobby's entire treatment team. Her voice carried the excitement of someone who'd spent a career waiting for a case exactly like this one. "What if this isn't an infection at all, but a sophisticated biological partnership that took 40 years to perfect?" The paradigm shift she proposed challenged everything the medical team thought they understood about Bobby's condition. Instead of viewing the bacteria as invaders that needed elimination, Dr. Chen suggested they might be beneficial organisms that had evolved to serve essential functions in Bobby's immune system. "Think of it like a coral reef," she explained, pulling up microscopic images on her laptop. "The bacteria and Bobby's tissue have created a complex ecosystem where each component serves the others. Remove one element, and the entire system collapses." Dr. Harrison, despite his surgical experience, found himself struggling to accept a theory that contradicted decades of medical training. "Are you suggesting we should reintroduce the infection we just removed?" "I'm suggesting we should consider that what we removed wasn't an infection in the traditional sense, but rather a biological system that was keeping Bobby alive and relatively healthy despite significant tissue damage." The family conference that followed felt like attending a university lecture on advanced biology, except the subject under discussion was Bobby's life hanging in the balance. Dr. Chen's explanation required multiple attempts at simplification before David and Jennifer could grasp the revolutionary implications of her theory. "Your father's body spent 40 years learning to work with these bacteria," Dr. Chen told them. "They were producing anti-inflammatory compounds, fighting off more dangerous infections, and essentially serving as a biological pharmacy that kept him functional despite his injury." Jennifer felt her nursing background engage as she processed the information. "So, when you removed them during surgery, you eliminated his body's natural defense system?" "Exactly. His immune system is now attacking the surgical site because it no longer recognizes the tissue without its bacterial partners. It's like removing a translator during a peace negotiation. Suddenly nobody can communicate, and war breaks out." The experimental treatment Dr. Chen proposed sounded like something from a medical science fiction novel. Using the bacterial cultures that had been growing in the lab since Bobby's surgery, they would essentially reintroduce controlled amounts of his original bacterial ecosystem while carefully monitoring his immune response. The risks are enormous, Dr. Harrison admitted during his consultation with the family. We'd be deliberately introducing bacteria into a patient whose immune system is already compromised. If Dr. Chen's theory is wrong, we could kill him. And if you do nothing? David asked. He dies anyway, Dr. Harrison replied with the brutal honesty that crisis situations demanded. Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening to the medical discussions with the patience of someone who'd spent 72 years watching doctors debate life and death decisions, finally spoke with the authority that comes from witnessing human nature in extremis. Bobby Mitchell spent 40 years living with something nobody understood. If anyone can survive something nobody's ever tried, it's him. The consent process felt surreal. Bobby remained unconscious, his condition too critical for him to participate in decisions about his own treatment. David found himself signing papers that authorized an experimental procedure that had never been attempted on a human patient, based on theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about infection and immunity. Sarah would want us to fight, he told Jennifer as they sat beside Bobby's ICU bed. She never gave up on anything, especially not on him. The bacterial reintroduction began at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, with Dr. Chen personally overseeing every step of the process. The treatment team had assembled in Bobby's ICU room like a surgical unit, monitoring equipment tracking every vital sign, while carefully controlled amounts of his original bacterial cultures were introduced through IV lines. It's like performing surgery on an ecosystem, Dr. Chen explained to the medical students who'd been granted permission to observe. We're trying to rebuild a biological relationship that took decades to develop, and we have hours to make it work. The first hour brought no change in Bobby's condition, which Dr. Chen assured everyone was actually positive news. No immediate rejection means his immune system isn't treating the reintroduced bacteria as foreign invaders. The second hour brought subtle improvements in Bobby's inflammatory markers that had the medical team exchanging cautious glances. His white blood cell count began dropping from the dangerous levels that had characterized his crisis, suggesting his immune system was beginning to recognize the reintroduced bacteria as allies rather than enemies. By the third hour, Bobby's fever had broken for the first time in 4 days. Jennifer watched the digital readouts with the intensity of someone whose life had been reduced to the meaning contained in numbers on screens. When his temperature dropped below 101 degrees, she felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. "It's working," Dr. Foster whispered, studying the lab results that showed Bobby's immune markers returning toward normal ranges. His body is remembering how to coexist with the bacteria. The fourth hour brought the first signs of neurological improvement. Bobby's eyes began moving beneath closed lids, suggesting that the sedation keeping him unconscious was no longer fighting against crisis-level physiological stress. Dr. Chen reduced the sedation gradually, watching for signs that Bobby might be ready to return to consciousness. Emma and Jake had spent Sunday afternoon in the hospital chapel with Mrs. Henderson, lighting candles and offering prayers that mixed Catholic traditions with 8-year-old theology. When David came to find them with news of Bobby's improvement, Emma's first question was whether their prayers had been answered. "I think Grandpa's getting better because he's tough," David told his children, "but maybe the prayers helped too." At 6 o'clock Sunday evening, Bobby Mitchell opened his eyes for the first time in 4 days. His first word was, "Sarah," spoken so softly that only Jennifer, who was holding his hand, heard it clearly. His second word was "thirsty," which prompted laughter from medical staff who'd been wondering if they'd ever hear his voice again. "Welcome back, Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Chen said, checking his pupils with a pen light. "You've been on quite an adventure." Bobby's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier, but his personality was unmistakably intact. "Doc, I dreamed I was in some kind of medical textbook. Please tell me that was just the drugs talking." "I'm afraid you're going to be in quite a few medical textbooks," Dr. Harrison replied. "But first, let's make sure you're strong enough to enjoy the fame." The reunion with his family was carefully managed by ICU staff who understood the emotional intensity of near-death recoveries. Emma and Jake approached their grandfather's bed with the reverent caution, children reserve for miracles they don't quite understand, but recognize as important. "Grandpa, you scared us," Emma said, taking his hand with the gentle firmness that 12-year-olds employ when addressing adults who've worried them. "Sorry about that, sweetheart. Sometimes old Marines need reminding that they're not as tough as they used to be." Dr. Chen's post-treatment analysis confirmed what the monitoring equipment had been suggesting throughout the afternoon. Bobby's immune system had not only accepted the reintroduced bacteria, but had begun rebuilding the complex biological relationships that had sustained him for 40 years. "This is unprecedented in medical literature," she explained to the assembled medical team. "We've essentially performed the first successful ecosystem transplant in human history." The implications extended far beyond Bobby's individual case. The successful reintroduction of beneficial bacteria opened possibilities for treating chronic conditions that had previously been considered incurable. Patients with antibiotic-resistant infections, chronic inflammatory diseases, and immune system disorders might benefit from treatments based on Bobby's unique biological partnership. "You realize what this means?" Dr. Foster asked Dr. Chen as they reviewed the day's data. "We've just proven that some infections might actually be medical treatments that haven't been recognized yet." As Sunday evening settled over Boston General, the ICU waiting room filled once again with neighbors and friends who'd maintained their vigil through Bobby's crisis. Mrs. Henderson had coordinated another meal schedule, this time focused on celebration rather than crisis management. "Bobby Mitchell's tougher than a $2 steak," Frank Kowalski announced to anyone within hearing range. "I told you people he wasn't going anywhere." But it was Bobby himself who provided the day's final perspective on his medical adventure. When David asked how he felt about being the subject of revolutionary medical research, Bobby's response carried the practical wisdom that had sustained him through 4 decades of chronic pain. "Son, if this old leg can help some other folks avoid what I've been through, then every sleepless night was worth it. Sarah always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe this was mine." 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that painted Boston's autumn leaves in shades of gold and crimson, Bobby Mitchell stood in his auto shop for the first time since his medical odyssey had begun. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings filled his lungs like a homecoming prayer. And for the first time in 40 years, he could stand for more than 10 minutes without the familiar knife twist of pain that had been his constant companion since Vietnam. The transformation was remarkable not just in its medical implications, but in the simple human miracle of watching a man reclaim his life. Bobby moved around the shop with an ease that made David remember his father from childhood, before chronic pain had carved permanent lines around his eyes and taught him to measure every step carefully. The bacteria that Dr. Chen had reintroduced weren't just keeping him alive. They were giving him back the life he'd lost 4 decades earlier. Mitchell's Auto Repair had become something of a pilgrimage site for medical professionals from around the world. The small garage on Beacon Hill regularly hosted researchers, physicians, and medical students who wanted to meet the man whose case had revolutionized understanding of chronic infections. Bobby tolerated the attention with the same stoic grace he'd applied to 40 years of pain, though he drew the line at charging admission for what he called looking at an old Marine's leg. The Bobby Mitchell Institute for Symbiotic Medicine had opened at Boston General in September, funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health and international medical organizations eager to study the implications of Bobby's successful treatment. Dr. Chen had accepted the position of director, relocating from Atlanta to oversee research that was already showing promise for treating conditions ranging from antibiotic-resistant infections to autoimmune disorders. "We've got patients coming from 6 countries now," Dr. Chen explained during one of her regular checkups with Bobby. "Your bacterial cultures have been adapted to help treat chronic wounds in diabetic patients, inflammatory bowel disease, even some forms of arthritis. You've literally become a living pharmacy." Bobby listened to these updates with the bemused tolerance of someone who'd never asked to become a medical celebrity, but had accepted the role with characteristic grace. His primary concern remained the practical matters of daily life, keeping his auto shop running, maintaining relationships with customers who'd supported him through his crisis, and enjoying his grandchildren without the constant distraction of chronic pain. The financial transformation had been as dramatic as the medical one. The experimental treatment that had saved Bobby's life had been covered entirely by research grants, eliminating the crushing medical debt that had threatened to bankrupt the family. More significantly, Bobby had become eligible for substantial disability back payments from the VA, which had finally recognized that his 40-year struggle with chronic pain constituted a service-connected disability deserving compensation. 40 years of stubbornness finally paid off, Bobby told Frank Kowalski during one of their morning coffee sessions at the auto shop. "Sarah always said the government would eventually do right by veterans. Took them long enough." The shop itself had undergone renovations that accommodated Bobby's new role as an informal spokesman for veteran healthcare issues. A small office had been added where he met with reporters, researchers, and fellow veterans who sought advice about chronic pain management. The walls displayed framed articles from medical journals alongside traditional auto shop decorations, creating an unusual blend of scientific recognition and blue-collar authenticity. Emma and Jake had adapted to their grandfather's celebrity status with the resilience that children bring to extraordinary circumstances. Emma's science fair project on bacterial symbiosis had won the state competition, inspired by detailed conversations with Dr. Chen about the biological mechanisms that had saved her grandfather's life. Jake had started a collection of newspaper clippings about Bobby's case, proudly showing them to classmates who were impressed by having a scientifically famous grandfather. "Grandpa, are you going to be in our science textbooks?" Jake asked during Sunday dinner at the family's traditional gathering place, Bobby's kitchen table where Sarah's empty chair had gradually transformed from a painful reminder into a comfortable presence. "Probably, buddy. Though I suspect they'll use bigger words than I would to explain what happened." Mrs. Henderson had appointed herself the unofficial curator of Bobby's growing collection of medical awards and honorary degrees. Universities from Harvard to Johns Hopkins had recognized his contribution to medical science, though Bobby insisted that the honors belonged more properly to the researchers who'd figured out how to save his life. "They're giving credit where credit's due," she argued, dusting the citation from the American Medical Association that hung beside his Purple Heart. 40 years of suffering without complaining, that takes a special kind of courage. The neighborhood had rallied around Bobby's success with the same intensity they'd shown during his crisis. The auto shop had become an unofficial community center where customers lingered to hear updates about the latest medical research inspired by Bobby's case. Maria Santos from the grocery store had started bringing lunch for the visiting researchers, claiming that smart people need good food to think properly. Dr. Harrison had become something of a celebrity himself, presenting Bobby's case at medical conferences around the world and co-authoring papers that were reshaping how surgeons approached chronic infections. His collaboration with Dr. Chen had produced treatment protocols that were being tested at major medical centers, with early results suggesting that bacterial ecosystem management might become a standard approach for complex chronic conditions. Bobby's case has generated more research interest than anything I've seen in 30 years of medicine, Dr. Harrison explained during a visit to the auto shop that had become as much social call as medical follow-up. We're getting calls from researchers studying everything from gut microbiomes to wound healing. His bacteria are apparently remarkable teachers. The broader implications of Bobby's case extended beyond individual medical treatment to questions of healthcare policy and veteran care. Congressional hearings on veteran healthcare had featured testimony about Bobby's 40-year struggle with inadequate treatment, leading to increased funding for research into chronic pain management and improved protocols for treating service-connected injuries. One old Marine's infected leg shouldn't have to revolutionize how we treat veterans, Bobby testified during a House Veterans Affairs Committee hearing. But if it helps other folks get better care faster, then I guess it served its purpose. The personal transformation had been equally remarkable. Bobby's relationship with his family had deepened through their shared crisis, creating bonds that went beyond the traditional obligations of blood relation. David had started spending more time at the auto shop, learning the business he might someday inherit while enjoying conversations with his father that were no longer shadowed by constant worry about Bobby's health. Jennifer had returned to nursing school part-time, inspired by her experience with Bobby's case to specialize in chronic pain management. Her thesis project focused on family dynamics in long-term illness, drawing from her observations of how the Mitchell family had navigated 4 decades of uncertainty and crisis. Bobby's case taught us that families are part of the treatment team, she explained to her nursing school professors. His recovery wasn't just medical, it was relational. The bacteria might have saved his life, but family love kept him alive long enough for the bacteria to work. The wedding anniversary celebration for what would have been Bobby and Sarah's 45th year together had become a neighborhood tradition. Bobby spent the day at Sarah's graveside, sharing stories about the medical adventure she'd missed and seeking her advice about the responsibilities that came with unexpected fame. "You'd get such a kick out of all this fuss," he told her headstone, placing fresh flowers beside the memorial bench David had installed. "Remember how you always said I'd make my mark on the world somehow? I don't think either of us imagined it would involve bacteria, but you were right about the important part." The Christmas morning that marked Bobby's full recovery found the Mitchell family gathered around the same kitchen table where they'd shared countless meals during the crisis months. The conversation mixed updates about medical research with ordinary family news: Emma's middle school achievements, Jake's Little League aspirations, David's promotion to fire captain, Jennifer's nursing school progress. "You know what the best part of this whole medical circus has been?" Bobby asked as he carved the turkey with steady hands that showed no sign of the tremors that had once betrayed his hidden pain. "The money?" Jake guessed, prompting laughter from adults who remembered the financial crisis that had threatened to destroy the family. "The fame," Emma suggested, thinking of the news interviews and medical journal articles that had made her grandfather recognizable to strangers. "Nope," Bobby replied, looking around the table at faces that had sustained him through 4 decades of struggle. "The best part is sitting here with all of you, carving turkey without my hand shaking, and knowing that every day from now on is a gift I almost didn't get to unwrap." As Boston's winter snow began falling outside the kitchen windows, the Mitchell family settled into the comfortable rhythm of ordinary happiness, the kind of simple contentment that only comes after surviving something that threatened to destroy everything worth preserving. Bobby's medical miracle had given him back his life, but it was love that had made that life worth living in the first place. Sometimes life tests us in ways we never imagined, and Bobby Mitchell's story reminds us that our greatest struggles often carry our most profound gifts. For 40 years, This Marine endured chronic pain in silence, never knowing that his suffering was creating something miraculous, a biological partnership that would revolutionize medicine and help millions of others. Like so many of us who've weathered decades of challenges, Bobby discovered that persistence isn't just about surviving, it's about transforming our pain into purpose. His story speaks to every senior who's ever wondered if their struggles matter, if their quiet endurance serves any greater meaning. At 65, when most people might consider their best years behind them, Bobby became a medical pioneer whose discovery opened new frontiers of healing. His journey from isolated suffering to celebrated breakthrough proves that it's never too late for our lives to take on extraordinary significance. The love of family, the support of community, and the courage to keep fighting, these aren't just nice sentiments, they're the forces that turn ordinary people into heroes. Bobby's bacterial partners taught him that sometimes what we think is breaking us is actually making us stronger, preparing us for a purpose we never saw coming. What challenge in your life has unexpectedly led to growth or helped others? Have you ever discovered that something you thought was holding you back was actually preparing you for something greater? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who's struggling today.